Are we in the show? Okay.
Okay, great.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Andre Ferraz. I'm here with Roberto Colecchia. We're both from Incognia. And today we're going to talk about location permissions and how to drive higher opt-in rates. We brought here a presentation in which we're going to bring some interesting statistics about this topic. And I think we're going to share the slides in a second. So just starting with a quick introduction, I'm Andre Ferraz. I'm the CEO and co-founder at Incognia. I'm based here in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I'll let Roberto introduce himself quickly so we can get started.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. My name is Roberto Colecchia. I'm product marketing from Incognia, and I'm based also in the San Francisco Bay Area. Nice meeting you. Welcome.
Awesome. All right. So let's go here. So just to bring a quick agenda for you, first item that we're going to talk about is basically some reasons why users would share their location data. So we're going to bring some studies from some top universities like Carnegie Mellon, for example. The second item here is that we're going to talk in more detail the like how to request location permissions to drive higher opt-in rates. So basically bringing some tips from what we identified as the main ways to do it to be more successful on achieving higher opt-in rates. And then finally, we're going to talk also about not only how to ask it, but also when to request location permissions. So the next thing here is basically like why, in which situations users are willing to share the location and which data more specifically users are willing to share, right? So this study was made by the Carnegie Mellon University. They did a survey with a lot of users to try to identify which type of data points users were more comfortable sharing, right? And what's particularly interesting here is that location, both fine and coarse, and the difference here is basically the precision. Both are data points that users are open to sharing with their applications. So that contrasts a lot with SMS and contact information. So for example, people are less willing to share, for example, information about the contacts that they have stored on their device, right? So basically their social network is considered more sensitive by these users. Same applies to SMS. People don't want to be receiving text messages all the time. As we know, and all of us, we receive a lot of spam on our inbox when it comes to SMS and also email. So users are less willing to share this type of information with their apps. But the good news here is, again, users are open to sharing their location data a lot more than these other data points. So the other insight here is about the types of applications in which users are more willing to share location data, right? And there is a direct relationship between this and the use of location by this application. So for example, the apps in which users are most willing to share their location data are exactly the apps that have location features that are related to the use of location, right? So applications like Google Maps, for example, almost 100%. Why? Because Google Maps needs location data in order to function well, in order to show to the user where they're located, right? Gas Buddy is also an application that relies on location data. You don't want to be seeing like the gas prices of places that are very far from you. You want to see the prices that are from gas stations that are nearby, right? Yelp, same thing. You want to see like offers from restaurants that are close to you. And if we compare this to another application on the extreme opposite side here, like SoundHound, for example, or Messenger, these applications, they don't really have any compelling feature that leverages location data, right? So what's particularly interesting, and we're starting to see in other industries like food delivery and social media companies, but also fintech and banks, is that users are more willing to share their location data also if this information will be used to protect their accounts, right? So if the use of location is for security purposes, if the use of location is for fraud prevention purposes, we also see that users are more willing to share this data, right? So um, just recapping the two last pieces of data that I just shared with you. One, users are willing to share location information a lot more than like SMS or contact information. And users are more willing to share location data when there is some functionality, some feature on that application that leverages this data, right? So that includes obviously things that are related to navigation and mapping, but also relates a lot to features like fraud prevention and account security, because users obviously they want that, especially when we're talking about financial services apps as well, right? So this study here was made by the University of California, and also brought some interesting insights. So on the next one, the what is particularly interesting is that what makes also a big difference is the transparency in the communication with the user, right? So providing a clear reason that explains like why you need access to location data from that user also drives higher opt-in rates. And what's particularly interesting, and I have been personally working in the location industry for now more than 10 years, is that prior to starting Incognia, which is in the fraud prevention and security space, I was running another business called InLoco. And what InLoco did at the time was to leverage location data for marketing and advertising purposes. And during that time, I was used to seeing opt-in rates usually below 40%, in most cases around 20 to 30%. And the reason why was basically because this data was being used by these applications for marketing purposes, and users tend not to like that, right? Now that we switched gears and we're using this data for security and fraud prevention purposes, we're seeing opt-in rates usually above 80%, in many cases above 90%. So being clear with your user and explaining why you're leveraging this data is key to drive higher opt-in rates, especially if the functionality is really useful. So if you're doing it for fraud prevention purposes, if you're doing it for security purposes, if you're doing it for navigation or mapping purposes, you're certainly going to reach very high opt-in rates, especially if you are transparent with your user and you tell them why you're asking for this data. So coming up next, we're going to talk about how to ask for the location permissions, and I'll let Roberto take it away from here.
Okay, thank you, Andre. So basically, the next slide, we want to focus on some real case scenarios that we have seen in the real world that really works very well for users to opt in and share their location, and some strategies that you could use in order to make sure your user share your location, their location. So the first thing is very important, as Andre was mentioning, is how to request the location permission. So we want to include some educational content, including also explaining the importance and the benefits of sharing the location. And in this case, we see an example of how we call it a kind of optimized permission request, where there is a first screen, which is a primer screen or kind of pre-request screen on the left, where you should explain why the permission request is asked and what are the benefits and the advantages of the user to opt in. After the user understands about that and basically clicks on the enable location services, then you can go to the next screen on the right, which has the operating system request, either on Android or iOS. Is really the real request about sharing the location, the permission to get the location. And this can be either opt-in on the allow when using the apps, or one time only, depending on how the user wants to do it. Then he has the opportunity on the second screen to really approve it. But the first screen is very important to prime and to explain the reason why to the user. So we call it kind of optimize kind of strategy. On the next one is another way we can kind of reiterate it. So you should try to use and include any extra opportunity for the user to accept. So in this case, on the left side, there is the primer screen where you can explain to the user what are the benefits for the user to opt in to the location permission. But if the user clicks on not now, then you can pop up the second screen, which is a pop-up window, say, are you really sure you don't want to enable your permission? Because we are going to use it to protect your account, to get you a lot of benefits. And in this point, basically, if it's canceled and it's accepted, then you can go to the operating system and to accept and to really allow the permission either one time or using the app or so on. So we see that more time you give the opportunity for the user to opt in, that's really better for the opt-in rate, to really going to increase the opt-in rate. So that's basically two examples of the how. I think it's up to you to test this kind of solution in kind of A/B testing in your case, but I think both of them we see working very well in increasing the opt-in rate of location permission. Another step that we want to discuss about when asking for location permission is also very important. So in case of onboarding, for example, when you are onboarding and creating a new account in financial institution or any kind of account online, during the onboarding, and for example, you need to ask for the user address. Before typing the address, you should explain to the user why they need to opt in for the location permission, what are the benefits. So at that specific point, so you understand that, oh, he has to do some function. This is required to provide some security to this function. So I will allow that. So providing the location permission request before the address entering steps is very important, for example, in case of onboarding. Another case we see in a real case scenario is case of login. If you want to use location to protect logins from account takeovers or some other kind of frauds, then you can ask for the location permission just after the request of the creation account username and password, explaining the benefits of why location is requested to help the security of the account, and then going to the operating system screen on the right side. So really, during the login phase, you can ask it that specific point, and the user will understand the value and see that this operation really help him to increase the security of login. And the last one I want to show is a case of a transaction. There are some payment application, for example, that request some special permission, special validation of the user before doing some very high level kind of transaction. In this case, requesting location to validate a sensitive transaction. In this case, we have maybe $1,000. And if a user wants to transfer more than $1,000, he should ask for location verification. And then in this case, we can apply the request to opt-in during this transfer operation. The user will understand exactly why the location permission is requested, and then we can go to the operating system screen to ask for it. So also, as I mentioned before, as a summarize is how to ask it with like primer screen, reiterated request, but also when at different stages of the flow, whenever you need to have the location to protect the user, then you can act at that specific point also makes a difference. Yeah, on the next one, basically, Andre, maybe you can summarize the key takeaways.
Awesome. Thanks, Roberto.
Welcome.
Yeah. So as we've seen here today, the first insight here was that users are willing to share the location if they perceive value, right? So as we've seen, they're more willing to share location data than sharing contact information or data to receive SMS. So that was the first one. But also when we see the breakdown of the opt-in rates for different applications, we see very clearly that the apps that offer real value, real functionality by using location data tend to reach much higher opt-in rates than apps that are not really leveraging this data. to provide value for the consumer, right? So users are definitely willing to share the location if they perceive value. The second thing here is around how to request, right? And we've seen that when the apps are transparent with their users, they tend to reach much higher opt-in rates, especially if they're using, for example, the primer screens to make it clear that like why this data is going to be used, etc. So then when the user gets to the moment to decide if they want to share or not, they already know that there is value there. So that's another thing. And also finally, the timing is very important. So deciding when to ask for location information is also extremely important. And that obviously will depend on your application, right? So if you're using location data for fraud prevention purposes, for example, and you want to request this type of information only when the user gets to the point of moving a large sum of money, for example, you could do that, right? But you can also do it in the very beginning of the customer journey when they are onboarding to the application, because in this case, for example, you could use the location data to validate address information from that user, so you can provide a streamlined onboarding experience, right? So there are different ways of applying this, and deciding when to ask for the location permission is also very important. So this was quite efficient. We were able to go through everything here in less than 20 minutes. So now we're gonna open up for questions from the audience, and I think we already have the first one here. So from the approaches that were shared, minimalistic, optimized, and reiterated, which Incognia recommends for higher opt-in rates? So, well, I'll share my opinion here, and I'll let Roberto talk about it as well. So, in my view, I actually like the reiterated better, because then things are more clear to the user, right? Like, why am I sharing this information with this application? The reiterated, I think is more interesting because of that. Um, another thing that I also think a lot about, but that depends also on the type of application, is the more specific opt-in for specific type of transactions, right? So the last example that Roberto has provided is quite interesting, which is when you get to the point in which you're doing a sensitive transaction, you can ask again in case you didn't provide location permissions before that. So I think mixing these two is the ideal flow, right? So you start with the reiterated right up front when the user downloads the app. You explain very clearly why this data is going to be leveraged. In the examples we provided here, those were related to fraud prevention and security, which is where we're seeing very high opt-in rates. And in case the user doesn't allow access to their location data while using the app, if you need that information again in the future to perform a sensitive transaction, you can ask again. What do you think, Roberto?
Yeah, I agree with you. Basically, I think that there is a kind of always pro and cons. In case of the reiterated one, I think is the one that gives to the user more opportunities to share the information. On the other side, there is an extra screen. So you always want to minimize the screen, but also maximize the thing. So it's something that probably you should try to test on the A/B testing on your application, your cases. But I tend to favor more the reiterated one. However, we've seen some other applications using the other one are also successful on the optimized one. I recommend testing some of those. Yeah.
Nice. All right. Well, there's another question here, more related to fraud prevention, which is what happens when fraudsters do not share their location, right? Well, in this case, that is a signal in itself, right? We see that the vast majority of legitimate users tend to share location data with their apps if that data will be used for fraud prevention purposes. So when we identify that the user is not willing to share that, that's a yellow flag, I would say, not a red flag yet. It would be a red flag in case that user already shared location permissions in the past, and then we see a new device trying to access that account, but in this new device, this user is not willing to share location. So that means that this is probably not the original user. This is not the owner of the account. It might be someone else trying to take over that account. So in this case, it would be a red flag. If we already seen this user sharing in the past, but then we identify a new device that is not willing to share, right? So that in itself is a very important signal, because we see that when legitimate users are authorizing a new device, right? So let's say they just bought a new iPhone and they want to log in to their account on this new device. We see that about 89% of these new devices, when they're authorized, they are at one of what we call trusted locations, right? Which are basically the locations that are part of that user's routine, right? And that would be your office, your home, places like that, right? So in this case, it would depend on the scenario in which the user is not willing to share this type of data. And in case we identify that as a risky event, we're going to recommend that the app steps up the authentication process, and that could happen using multiple forms of MFA, right? Multi-factor authentication. So this is going to introduce more friction to the user experience, and the way to remove that is exactly by using location data as a way to authenticate and validate the user's identity. There is a third question here, which is, location is sensitive PII. How can I trust Incognia to process PII from users? Well, there are a couple of things, right? The first thing here is Incognia in particular is a security company, right? So we obviously apply the best practices when it comes to securing this data specifically. But more importantly, Incognia doesn't collect any other PII. So Incognia doesn't collect your name, your phone number, your email address, anything that can identify you, let's say in the real world, right? Why is this important? Because we want to avoid linkability, and that is, we don't want the location data to get mixed and linked to your personal information, right? Why is that? Because in the worst case scenario here, if the data eventually breaches, if Incognia is breached and the data leaks, right? Nothing will be related to any specific person, right? It would be only linked to encrypted and hashed identifiers from those users. But finally, the other thing is also about the process of asking, right? And the process of asking for the permission. So also the good practice here is being clear with the user why we want to use this data, that this data is not going to be used, for example, to sell like targeted advertising or marketing purposes. This data is going to be used to protect your account. This data will be used to prevent fraud, to prevent bad actors from accessing your data, from accessing your finances, and hurting your business, for example. I think this was probably the last question. So if you want any additional information, feel free to send us an email at info@incognia.com, or to scan this QR code here on your screen so you can schedule a meeting with our team. It was a pleasure to be here. Thanks again for being part of this. Thanks, Roberto, for joining us.
Thank you, everybody.
And yeah, this was again a very, very efficient webinar. We were able to close it in less than 25 minutes. Thanks again. I'll let you make better use of this time, and hope to see you soon.
Okay, thank you.
Have a nice one.
Bye.
Bye.